Okay, so in today's tutorial, we're going to learn how to use GraphQL from a Spring Boot application. But before we jump into the code, we need to know a few basics first. So let's get into it. So here we have a representation of the typical 3-tier application. At the bottom, we have the persistence layer. That's typically where we deal with databases, where we deal with saving and retrieving our data. In the middle, we have the business logic layer, and that's where we do all of the rules. That's where we code all of the things a software should do. And then at the top level, we have the presentation layer. So that takes the data and then makes it available to users in the way that they can understand. Now, both GraphQL and REST exist at that presentation layer, whereas the business logic and the persistence logic would typically be the same for both a REST application and a GraphQL application, at least in Spring Boot anyway. The domain model should be pretty familiar by now. It's the books and authors one. So we have books, and books have an ISBN, which is a unique identifier, which identifies just that book. And a book has a title, it's usually on the front cover. And then a book has an author, someone who wrote that book. If we take a look at the author here, we can see that the author has an ID, and then we have the name of the author, and then we have the age of the author. And the way that we've got this set up is that a book can have one author, but an author can have many books. So let's talk a little bit about the practical differences between REST and GraphQL here. So in REST, if you wanted to get all of the books, give me all of the books that you have available, you might do a call to get, the HTTP verb, /books to get a list of books, typically returned in JSON. In GraphQL, it's a little bit different. Now, GraphQL can be used in a number of different ways. It doesn't have to be used over HTTP. It could be used over WebSockets or any number of different things. But for the sake of argument, we're just going to use HTTP in this case. So the comparison would be we would post to a single endpoint. In this case, it's /GraphQL, and we would send a query. And that query would contain list books, a query that was known to the server. And we're saying in the list books query here that we want to get the ISBN, the title, and of the related author, their name and age returned. And then that would be returned and could be represented in JSON. So that's the basics of the basics when it comes to GraphQL. Let's take a look at some code. So here we have the code of our project. Let me talk you through it. So the first place we should look is the dependencies here. Now, there shouldn't be anything too surprising because we have a database in play that we're going to interact with using Java objects. So we've got our Spring Starter data JPA there. We're using HTTP, so we've got a Spring Boot Starter web. And then because we want to use GraphQL, there's a starter for that. So we're using Spring Boot Starter GraphQL. Now, we've also got Lombok just to reduce some boilerplate code for us. And we're running an in-memory H2 database. We need a dependency for that as well. And we're using Flyway to load in the information to our database on startup. I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. And then we have the Spring Boot starter test there as well. So that's our dependencies. Let's take a little look at our GraphQL configuration. So if we go to source main resources, we should have here a GraphQL directory. And inside that, we've got schema.gqls. Now, if we take a look at this, we can see it's pretty basic. We have a type, which is our query, and we're declaring two queries here. We've got list books, which returns just an array of book. We have book by ISBN, which we pass in an ISBN to, and that ISBN must be provided. It cannot be null, and it returns a book, which could be null. Of our types here, we have the type book, which has ISBN title and a link to author. And then on the author type, it has an ID, a name, and a string. And all of these attributes have an exclamation mark after them, so they cannot be null. So you'll notice here the book and the author represented in exactly the same way that we had on that slide from earlier. So we're representing our information here, and we're representing the queries that we are making available. So I think the best place to start now is with our domain object. So we have book here, and we can see it's got the ISBN, which is a string, title, which is a string, and then a relation to author. Note that we've got the annotations on here to make it work with Spring JPA, so it relates to the table books. And we can see there's a many-to-one relationship here. And if we take a look to the author, we can see the author's got the ID, the author's got the name, and the author's got an age as well. So exactly the same information represented in our Java domain objects, in our GraphQL, and the same that you saw on the slides from earlier as well. So these are our objects. Let's start at that bottom layer, that persistence layer first. So let's take a look at our repositories. Now, in our book repository here, because we're using Spring Data JPA and Hibernate, we don't actually have to implement it. What we've done is declare a book repository, extending CRUD repository to give us that create, read, update, and delete behaviors, saying that we're dealing with book, and the book's unique identifier is of type string. And that's going to give us most of what we need to deal with books at a database level. So that's pretty much our persistence layer. So let's take a look at our service layer, shall we? So if we go into services here, we have a book service. And you'll notice it has two methods. One, which is just get books, so give me all of the books that you have available in the database. And this other one is get book, passing in an ISBN, and it returns an optional book. So if the book exists, you'll get an optional book. And if the book doesn't exist, you'll get an optional empty. So you'll notice these two methods are very similar to the ones that we've declared in our GraphQL configuration. So more on that in a little bit. Let's take a look at our presentation layer now. So let's take a look at our controllers. So we have one controller here, which is the GraphQL controller. It's annotated with @controller, and we've got access to the book service, which we are auto wiring in via the constructor. So we have that book service that we were looking at a moment ago. We have two public methods with the query mapping annotation on top. And the query mapping annotation is a thing that tells Spring that this method is the implementation of what's declared inside of the queries part of our GraphQL configuration in source main resources. So you'll notice this is called list books. So if we go back to our schema, we can see that list books is declared in here. We can also see there's book by ISBN. So if we go back to our GraphQL controller, we've also got book by ISBN. So the name of the method matches what's declared inside of the query part of our GraphQL schema. And we can see the implementations for these are pretty basic. So in list books case, we're just returning a list of all books by calling book service.getBooks. And by book ISBN, it's a little bit more complicated. So we're using this argument annotation, passing in the string ISBN, which then matches it up to this right here, the argument that we're passing in. And that puts the value into this variable ISBN that we can then pass into getBook, a method on the book service, and then we'll just return optional book. Now, the way that it's implemented is Spring Boot can deal with this. So in the case that the optional is empty, then that will be a GraphQL null. In the case that the book is present, then that would be a book in the case of our configuration. And that's our persistence layer, business logic layer, and our presentation layer implemented for a GraphQL application. But before we wrap this up, I just want to show you what we've done with Flyway here. So Flyway, if we look in source main resources and then go to DB migration, we can see here a SQL script. And this SQL script does a couple of things. It creates our table for authors and it populates it using this information here. So we can see there's authors like Abigail Rose, Adam Parker, Adeline Rivers, and we've got some IDs for them on the left and we've got some ages on the right. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see the same thing done for books. So we're creating the table for books here, and then we're populating it. You can see the ISBN, the name of the book, and then an ID, which then references the author that created that book. So Flyway on startup will populate our in-memory H2 database with all this information. So what that means is when our application starts up, we'll have access to 100 books and 100 authors that we can then query via our GraphQL API. So let's open a terminal window. I'm just going to start out via Maven, going Spring Boot Run. Hiya, quick interruption. So I'm trying to make software engineering as accessible to as many people as possible, but I need your help to do that. So if you found this useful today, be sure to like and subscribe because it really helps the channel out. And if you know someone you think might benefit from the content, be sure to share it with them. I'm sure they'll thank you, and it would make me very happy. Thank you so much. So here we are in Postman, ready to query our GraphQL API. So we're running on localhost port 8080, and by convention, the endpoint is /GraphQL. So we have all that information in here. How do we query a GraphQL API via Postman? It's very easy. So we'll go over to body, we'll select GraphQL, and then we can type in a query and any variables that we need to enter there. So let's type in a query to return us all of the books, shall we? So if we take a look at this query, we're calling list books, which is declared in our GraphQL schema configuration on our application. And I want the ISBN, the title of the book returned, and then of the author, I want the name and the age returned. And all I have to do is click on send. There we go. And our request is returned. So we can see here data list books, and we have our ISBN, title, author, name, age. So all of that information is returned. We've got a big old list here of all of the books and their related authors that was available in the database. That was super easy. So let's now change the information that's returned. Let's say we only care about the ISBN and the title of the book and nothing else. So we'll go into our query up here. We'll delete the author straight away. And in list books, all we want is the ISBN and the title. So if we send this, take a look at what's returned. We have our list books and we have our ISBN and our title and nothing else. So that's really rather cool. So that's our list books query. But what about the other one where we wanted to get the book by the ISBN? So this time we're going to use the query book by ISBN. And we can see here that we've got an argument ISBN and we've got this string, which represents an ISBN of the book in our database. And we want to return the ISBN entitled the book, and of the related author, we want the ID, the name, and the age. So let's go ahead and send this. There we go. We can see that the ISBN was for the book The Shadow in the Attic, and the author is Abigail Rose, ID 1, age of 80. Now, let me just show you how to use this GraphQL variable on the side here. So So with a very slight change, we're able to declare ISBN as a parameter to the query here, which is a string which cannot be null. On the right hand side, we've got a simple JSON object with ISBN and that ISBN provided. So we send this. You can see that the ISBN has been taken from our GraphQL variables here, and we get the shadow in the attic returned once more. So that's pretty much it when it comes to implementing a GraphQL API. Whilst implementing this, especially with list books, I couldn't help but think, if we got all of the books back that was in the database, and there was several million books in the database, that's a lot of data, enough to maybe crash our application or even the database. And that got me thinking about pagination, and I wanted to implement that. So let me show you what I did. So the first place I started is at the schema.gqls here. So in the query for list books, I declared two arguments. I've got page of type int and size of type int. And note that these can be nullable, so they don't have the exclamation mark, so they could actually be null. So you can provide two additional arguments now. So page denotes the page that you want returned, and the size of the page. You can include additional arguments for things like sorting, but we won't do those for the moment. So we have page and the size of the page declared in schema.gqls. The next thing that I did is I went over to my repository. So we go to book repository here. Rather than just extending CRUD repository, we now also extend paging and sorting repository. We have book, which is the type that this repository deals with, and string, the type of its ID. Now, paging and sorting repository gives you a lot of functionality around paging and sorting, believe it or not. So by book repository extending this, we get access to passing in the pageable object, which allows us to specify the page number and also the size of the page returned. So if we now take a look at the service layer, at book service here, we can see that get books now takes a pageable object and it returns a page of books rather than an iterable. Now a page, you can think of that as an extension of list. So yes, it contains a collection of books, but it also contains some metadata along with like the size of the page and how many pages are available and etc, etc, etc. So get books now takes a pageable and returns a page of book. Let's take a look at our presentation layer. So we go to the GraphQL controller here. We can see that list books is a little bit more elaborate, not by much. So we can see that list books takes two arguments. We have the argument page, assigning the value to the variable page here, and the same for size. We have the argument size, and it assigns the value to this size variable. Now, bookservice.getBooks is called, but we have to pass in an object of type pageable, and we can do that with page request. So we're saying here page request of, and it takes two arguments. The first argument is the page, so page 1, 2, 3. And the second one is the size, so how many things you want returned in that page, 5, 1, 100. So we can see here that we've got an optional in play. So we're basically saying that if page here is null, then default to 0. But if page is provided, then use whatever the value is. And we've done the same for size. So in this way, we're able to give some sensible defaults. So we'll start at page 0 and the page size will be 20. But if you provide either page or size in your GraphQL query, then we'll use the values provided. So let's start this application up and go test it over in Postman. So we'll use the GraphQL variables for this as well. So in the query, I've said there's a variable of page, which is an int, which could be null because it doesn't have the exclamation mark. And we've done the same for size here, which is also an int and can be null. And in list books, we're passing in a page argument using the value from page up here. And we're passing in a size argument using size from up here. Now, if we look over at the GraphQL variables, we've got page 0 and 20, which I know are also the defaults, but we can tweak those a little bit later on. So with the application now running, if we go up here and click on send, yes, okay, we get some back. That's good. What if we do a size of 1, for example? Great. So we only get 1 back. What if you want page 2 of size of 1? The last ember. What about page 3 size of 1? The forgotten key. What if we then want to make that size 15, for example? Then we get a lot more back. And there we go. How to use GraphQL from a Spring Boot application. Now, if you're still fairly new to Spring Boot and you don't fully understand how it all works just yet, be sure to check out the Spring Boot crash course, which takes you from a complete beginner to having a really firm understanding and a solid ground to build on. I'll see you over there.